I've followed you for years, but especially in this moment, having your expertise as somebody who studied Palestine in particular is very needed. And your work really is all about preserving Palestinian history, which, we spoke to Ilan Pappy on this program before, one of the Israeli new historians. We're just at the very beginning, I think, of a more mainstream, broader cultural understanding, historical understanding of what Palestinian history really, really is. And there are still efforts, though, to destroy that. I mean, every university in Gaza has been bombed at this point. One was a controlled demolition. So in terms of this moment for preserving Palestinian history, what are your kind of major goals and your overriding thoughts about this particular moment for your work?
Just to start with the problem statement, for more than a century, the Palestinian people have been completely erased from media in the United States. Going back long before World War II, there have been studies done showing that basically the Arabs don't exist. The Palestinian Arabs do not exist in Western media in the United States. The problem persists in the 1970s. A study came out in the publication Plus 972 a couple of years ago, showing how from 1970 to 2019, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and a couple of other publications, there was a lot written about Palestinians, but almost none of the articles published about Palestinians were written by Palestinians. In the New York Times, it was about 1%. So the Western media has basically left Palestinians out of the conversation. And so I think instead what you have is mainstream media, cable news, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, all of the major publications that cover foreign affairs. They do not give Palestinians in the words of Edward Said, the Palestinians do not have permission to narrate. And I think it's my goal to bring Palestinians, Palestinian history back on the table. So my website, Palestine Nexus, we publish documents, collections of documents, the most recent of which is a collection called the Gaza Collection, which is, I purchased many hundreds of documents, probably about 600 documents total from an antique dealer in Gaza. And his name is Salim El-Rais. And he's a refugee now, struggling to survive just like everyone else in Gaza. But I was able to purchase many hundreds of documents from him. So we have the Gaza Collection. These are documents dating all the way back to the Ottoman period. Property records, business transactions, personal papers, letters, family papers that Salim El-Rais went around Gaza and collected. And so that is all available for free to download on PalestineNexus.com. And I think more generally, I think my goal is to try and make Palestine history more accessible to broader audiences. And so what I do in my writing, my newsletter, on Twitter, is to try to demystify this conflict, right? It's quote unquote complicated, as all of these Western experts would have you believe, but in fact, it's actually not that complicated.
It's really not. Yes. It's quite easy. It's was imperialism, colonialism in the past. This is the modern version of it, and it's kind of a test, I think, of our the arc of moral progress, as democratic politicians like to refer to it, as to whether or not we recognize it as the reality that it is. So, I mean, I'm going to pick your brain then on some of these things that you are archiving, and Middle Eastern history and Palestinian history in particular. So for people that may be watching this for the first time and are not familiar with the history of the Palestinian people, Palestinian as an identifier, as a national identity, or a cultural identity, what are the first records of people identifying as Palestinian, and how that fit, I guess, into the broader Ottoman Empire as well?
Yeah, so the first instance of a Palestinian using that word in Arabic, Falastini or Falastiniyin, the plural, is in 1898. A guy named Khalil Beidas. He publishes a book. It's a translation of a Russian archaeologist's guide to the Holy Land, he translates it into Arabic, and he's using the word Palestinian to describe the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine, and he uses that word throughout the book. You also have articles coming by Najib Nasser and Salim Kobain in 1901. They're publishing articles titled "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town" in Arabic. In a journal called El Jamia, published in Alexandria. But even actually before that, if you go already starting in the 1870s and 80s, you have actually many English, German, and Russian sources who are describing the people of Palestine as Palestinians. I think one of the common myths about the origins of the Palestinian people is that the Palestinians only started to identify as such in response to Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases. That's a myth. These first Palestinians who started to call themselves Palestinians, why did they start to do that? Well, you have all of these schools opening up around the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, right? You have Ottoman schools, you have German schools, you have Russian schools. That's the school that Khalil Beidas went to, as well as Najib Nasser and Salim Kobain. So they're going to these schools. They're learning from textbooks called The History of Palestine, The Geography of Palestine. There are maps of Palestine posted on the walls. They're taken out of their home environments, and they're living in these boarding schools. Lo and behold, they start to, as well as being taken on trips around the Holy Land, visiting the holy sites in Jerusalem and Nazareth and wherever else. Lo and behold, by the first decade of the 20th century, they're all calling themselves Palestinians.
Right, and then the turn of the century happens. The Zionist project begins to kind of unfold at this point. There are the Balfour Declarations in 1917, but my understanding is that before that there were some Russian Jewish emigres that had begun moving to the area by that point as well. When did the Zionist project kind of begin in earnest, and how did that coincide with certain emigration to the area?
I think the first wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine traditionally is considered to be 1882. Maybe you could say 1878. But for the first 4 decades of Zionist immigration to Palestine, from the 1880s to World War I, you only get a few tens of thousands of Palestinians, a very small number. There's still less than 15%. On the eve of World War I, there's still less than 15%.
10 to 15% Palestinians, you meant Jewish immigrants, or emigres. Yeah.
Excuse me, apologies, I misspoke.
Just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the country, okay, so let's go back to 1870, sort of before Zionism. There is no Zionism in 1870. The land of Palestine is 85% Muslim, 10% Christian, 5% Jewish, roughly. By the eve of World War I, the Zionists have only a few tens of thousands of Zionists have immigrated to Palestine. The real uptick in Zionist immigration to Palestine does not happen until the 1930s. I mean, even as late as 1929, 1930, there's a big earthquake in Palestine. There's the disturbances of 1929. And even into the early 1930s, 1931, 1932, the Zionists are talking about how this project is failing. This project is not going as planned. There are not enough Zionists, are still less than 20% of the population. How is it you establish a Jewish country in a land that is 80% non-Jewish? Ask yourself that question. And by the way, all the Zionists did ask themselves that question. And they all, for the most part, almost every major Zionist thinker from 1880 to 1948 asked that question. And the majority of them landed on a similar answer, which was, well, these people, they have a strong national identity. They have deep roots in the country, and they're not going to leave voluntarily. And so there was basically only one real practical solution to solving the problem of the Arab question, as it was known then. It was transfer. That's how they called it back then. Now we would call that ethnic cleansing, which is exactly what happened in 1948. But to answer the question, yes, the real uptick in Zionist immigration did not happen until after 1933, right? It was basically when Hitler rose to power in Germany that you saw massive wave of Zionist immigration. In 1933 up until 1936, you get 30, 40, 50,000 Zionists immigrating to Palestine every year in the mid-1930s.
And at that point, I mean, what the Zionist project, how can you contextualize that within rising nationalism in the 20th century in Europe? Because based on my reading of some of your work, that's very central to understanding it, because that nationalism also led us into in part into 2 world wars, but it was very much so at kind of the core of what Zionists wanted to do in what is now Israel.
That's exactly right. You have this ideology spreading around Europe in the 19th century called nationalism that says that all the peoples of Europe are nations, and thus they all need their own national homeland. And the Jews are basically left out of that project of nationalism because the Jews in Austria are told they're not Austrians, they're Jews. And the French Jews are told, no, they're not French Jews, they're Jews. And the same is true in the Russian Empire. They're told they're not Russian Jews, they're Jews. And so they fail to integrate owing to the anti-Semitism and bigotry that they face in Europe. And so they ask themselves, okay, well, if we are Jews and we're not Germans and we're not French and we're not Russians, well, then what is our national homeland? And they settle on Palestine relatively quickly. They debate, there was a project to try and settle Jews in Sinai, in Argentina, and also in Africa, and I believe Uganda. But basically, very quickly, they realize that Jews won't actually move to those other places. Right. The only place that they can convince any number of Jews to move to actually try and build this Jewish state, this Jewish nation state, is in Palestine.
Right. And it really is these like European exports into the Middle East, one of nationalism based on that kind of identity, and then also colonialism, even though, of course, the Holocaust and the persecution faced by Jews in Europe and in Russia, as you say, is like the impetus for it. And it seems moral on its face within the context of what self-actualization or of what Jews were facing within that context, right? But then the context is, well, there were people living there, and here we go. We're going to just do a very European-style colonial nationalist project, but with all of this other kind of emotional weight behind it.
Make no mistake, the early Zionists, they saw themselves as colonizers. In fact,
they call themselves settlers, still to this day, by the way. But yeah,
to this day, I mean, really, in a very profound sense, one of the head of the Palestine office, the executive office in Palestine for the first decade and a half of the 20th century, Arthur Rupin. So he is born in Poland. And one of his first hire for that office is a German official who had previously worked in the German colonial administration that was in charge of transferring German citizens to Poland to try and create a German demographic majority in parts of Poland. And so he hired this guy. It's like, wow, this guy's perfect for the Zionist enterprise, because that's exactly what we're trying to do in Palestine, right? We're trying to transform the country from a demographic majority of Arabs, overwhelmingly, to a majority of Jews. So he hires this German colonial official into the Palestine office to help plan how you're going to actually transform the demography of Palestine. And then, of course, all of these Zionist institutions use that word, the Jewish Colonial Trust. The Zionist Colonial Trust, right? They're collecting money around Europe so that they can buy a plan in Palestine, right? The Jewish Colonization Society, they embrace as part of their self-conception is that they are colonizers. And in fact, they see themselves very much the same way that like Europeans saw themselves in South Africa and Australia and the United States. And they even draw very explicit comparisons to other European settler colonial movements.
Well, there's a reason that the Afrikaner government before apartheid was overthrown was very much joined at the hip with the Zionist Project and the new government of Israel. I remember reading in the 70s, kind of recently,